Hello everyone, FPL Raptor here and welcome back to another video on my YouTube channel. In today's video we have my Game Week 16 team selection, the final one before the World Cup for this first half of the season. If you have been enjoying the content for this first half of the season, please do remember to like, comment and subscribe. But without further ado, let's jump to today's video. So very briefly before we move on to Game Week 16, thought I'd just let you know how I did in Game Week 15, and it was a really good week for me, and I desperately needed it because I was on the back of 4 red arrows in the row. I got as low as 148th in the world, up to 1,813th after Game Week 14, but I am now back in the top 1k, so I'm up to 908th in the world now. Feels really nice to get back to that 3-digit rank, and perfect timing before the World Cup, so I can get a green arrow in 16 as well, and go into the World Cup on back-to-back green arrows. I'd be absolutely delighted with that, and it would mean that I'd stay inside the top 1k. So that is the aim. I don't care how small the green arrow is. It's just to get a very, very small green arrow in Game Week 16, and I would be absolutely delighted. I did finish on 69 points. It was a really strong week for me. Quite a few of my players actually blanked, but some pulled through massively. Pope lost his clean sheet, but Trippier got subbed off before the clean sheet, so I got the 12-pointer for Trippier. Unfortunately, only a 3-pointer for Pope. I do think he was on bonus, and he obviously got the save point as well, so we were looking at a minimum of about 7 or 8 points for Pope. Unfortunately, he did lose the clean sheet. Cancelo -2 was frustrating, but most people own Cancelo anyway, and because he can serve his suspension in the EFL Cup, he will be back for Game Week 16, so that doesn't pose an issue there. Castagna continuing to pull through for me. It's something like his 7th clean sheet in 8 games, and of course, he got the assist. He gets bonus points a lot of weeks as well. He's one of those players, along with Trippier from Game Week 1, I've owned Trippier, and also Pascal Gross earlier in the season, and then sort of Foden on the wildcard. I've picked a few players really well, and it's one of the reasons, obviously, that the rank is quite good at the moment. And Castagna has been one of those players, because around sort of, I think it was Game Week 10 or 11, I brought in Castagna, and there were loads of defenders I could have potentially gone for, but I think he's the highest scoring of all of those around that price. So I'm delighted that he continues to pull through for me. Every single week that I need him, he delivers. The midfield was a bit of a mixed bag. Saka got the single assist. Rashford and Martinelli both blanking. Salah pulling up with a 15-pointer. Obviously, I didn't do a deadline stream. I decided to bring in Alvarez and Rashford and decided not to bring in De Bruyne. Now, in my personal opinion, before the kickoff, before the deadline, I genuinely thought if Haaland doesn't start, De Bruyne is the best captaincy option. The only reason I didn't go for De Bruyne is I didn't want to sell Salah. So that obviously worked out very well for me, but very unlucky for those that brought in De Bruyne because I genuinely thought he was going to go absolutely massive. The only reason I didn't want to do it is I just didn't want to sell Haaland and Salah. So what I decided to do instead was bring in Rashford in that midfield spot for Foden, and I brought in Alvarez for Mitrovic. So I ended up captaining Alvarez and keeping Salah, and that was obviously massive rather than selling Salah and captaining De Bruyne, and I would have probably kept Mitrovic. So I know that sounds a bit complicated. Essentially, I think I made the right decision by keeping Salah and putting the armband on Alvarez. And then I kept Firmino and Haaland, which were 2 other players that I could have potentially sold. I'm glad I did keep Haaland because it looks, fingers crossed, which we'll discuss in the next section, that he will be starting in Game Week 16. I think he's fit to play. And also, I think Firmino's got a nice fixture as well. So I'm pretty happy that I kept those 2. The bench, I seem to get the bench order very, very wrong recently. Most of the time, I don't need to rely on the bench because my players don't substitute on. But Andreas was my top scorer, sitting in 3rd sub. He always delivers. Let me know down below if he's someone that does this for you. Every time he's on my bench, he gets points. And every time I start him, or anytime he subs on, he gets me absolutely nothing. So I think in the future, I guess I should just start him in more weeks because he tends to tick along. And I do think his price is slightly misleading. But that's basically the way we did in Game Week 15. Like I said, 69 points, back into the top 1k. Delighted that I kept Salah and Haaland as my 2 premiums because I do think even moving forward after the World Cup, because neither are going to the World Cup, they'll probably be the best 2 premiums to own. The team's in a good position, so let's look at how it looks for Game Week 16. So moving on to Game Week 16, and the team, as I seem to say most weeks, because I think I plan ahead quite well, is in a strong position. But for once, I actually only have the 1 free transfer. So I seem to just roll this season if the team's doing well and I don't need to make a transfer. But this week, because I used 2 last week, I've only got the 1. And I'm almost definitely, I would actually go as far as saying 100% sure I won't be taking a hit. The reason for that is it's only 1 week. And it's very difficult to try and predict if that hit will be paid back in a single week as opposed to over sort of 3 or 4 weeks. And also my bench is pretty strong. I would actually be happy playing any of my 3 outfield players on the bench. So even if there are injuries to deal with, even if Haaland does miss out, for example, I can't see any scenario that I would make 2 transfers. So I've basically got 1 free transfer to take 1 exciting punt, which I think is the position that a lot of people will be in. My team value did drop slightly because I sold Foden, who I actually had quite a bit of money tied up in. So my team value is at about 104 million now. I've got 2.7 million in the bank though. So I am pretty flexible for punts this week. After I've gone through my team, I'll then show you my watch list and discuss the potential players that I'm looking at bringing in for 1 week before we have our unlimited transfers. So in defence, it's looking relatively strong, but it's not looked as strong as it has been in recent weeks. I've obviously got Pope and Trippier still since the Game Week 8 wildcard. Chelsea at home, on paper, actually isn't a bad fixture. Chelsea have been really bad defensively, but also been pretty poor from an attacking perspective. I don't think Potter's quite worked out his best 11 yet. I don't think they've quite clicked under Potter. And I would fancy Newcastle to win this game. But if you were to ask me to predict the result, which sometimes I find very helpful when deciding whether I think my players will do well, I'll try and predict the result independent of FPL. I'd guess something like 2 or 3-1 to Newcastle. So for me, I do think Newcastle are likely to win this game. Almiron and Wilson are still going to be really good options. I don't necessarily fancy a clean sheet for Newcastle, though. I do think that Chelsea could get something. It is at home, though. Newcastle are very, very good defensively at home. And also, Pope could make a lot of saves. Trippier is so good from an attacking perspective. And yes, I could sell Pope for someone like Alisson, which I have thought about, or Lloris. There are loads of players that I could sell, or loads of keepers that I could sell Pope for. It feels like a really low upside move. And what I mean by that is, I think if you bring in an attacker, you can hope for sort of a 15, 20 points. You can dream of that idea of a hat trick. Yes, you could get like a penalty save by bringing in a keeper. It's very difficult to predict a keeper that will get a clean sheet, multiple saves and bonus, and then maybe a penalty save. So I just think that in a single game week, I don't think it makes a lot of sense to sell Pope as my free transfer. So unless something crops up which makes me think that Pope won't play, he's probably going to stay. Trippier will stay because I've got so much money tied up in him, and I just think he's been absolutely fantastic. He's got something like 14 returns in 15 games. So for the time being, those two stay. Post-World Cup, I think I'll probably keep Trippier, but I think I'll probably move Pope on and maybe go for a different, slightly cheaper goalkeeper. Castagna is one of my other defenders. There's a small chance Castagna doesn't start for me. The reason for that, as we'll discuss in a second, I've got 2 really strong defenders on my bench along with Castagna. And also, if I don't need to use a transfer on any of my attacking players, I could potentially bring in the likes of Trent or Perisic and play them ahead of Castagna. So for now, Castagna stays. But a lot of the potential transfers that I'm considering, and also if I think one of my bench options might be better, it might end up that I don't play Castagna, but I still think he's a great option. He's very, very attacking. He's got really good attacking data this season. I just think that West Ham will score, and at the end of the day, you need your defenders to keep clean sheets. And then we move on to Cancelo. 100% just to confirm this, because some people are getting a little bit confused. Cancelo is fine for Game Week 16. He served his suspension in the EFL Cup. It was not a 3-game ban because it wasn't violent conduct. It was like a professional foul. As a result, it was only a 1-game ban, and he served that 1-game ban in the EFL Cup. So Cancelo is fine for Game Week 16. Please don't sell Cancelo. Please start him. I think it's a really good fixture. I've seen a few people saying that maybe Cancelo will be like banished into the shadow realm because Pep doesn't like it when players make silly decisions. And he did make a comment that Cancelo, it was a bit of a silly decision from Cancelo to bring the player down. So maybe he doesn't start him. But by all accounts, I think Cancelo will be fine for Game Week 16. I wouldn't be selling him or benching him. So absolutely fine. And it's a great fixture. Brentford at home. I wouldn't be captaining him this week, but I do think it's a really nice fixture. And I would expect him to do fairly well. So that's the defence. I don't think there'll be any drastic changes. But like I said, I am considering Perisic and Trent. And because I have 2.7 million in the bank, I can sell one of my bench defenders, bring Perisic or Trent in, and actually put them in place of Castagna. So that's a potential option there. If I were to do that, I'm probably leaning towards Trent, but we'll discuss that in more detail in the watch list section. Now let's move on to the midfield. If you're enjoying the video so far, please do drop a like on the video. We're going to try and hit 2,000 likes on the video. Make sure to subscribe as well. We've just hit 50,000 subscribers, so I'm not going to set any subscriber targets, but I would really appreciate if you subscribe. It's completely free for you to do. You can always change your mind at a later date. So moving on to the midfield, I don't think at the moment, whilst I do think there are some really exciting Game Week 16 punts, I don't think I'm going to change my midfield because I think the 4 midfielders that I've got are all absolutely fantastic. I've got Andreas Pereira on the bench, who I don't want to sell because I've got a little bit of money tied up. And I also think against Manchester United, it's looking like Mitrovic will be out. Andreas is going to be on all set pieces, probably on penalties as well. And whilst Manchester United have been pretty decent defensively over the last 6 to 8, in recent weeks, they've started to concede a little bit more again. So I think this is a decent fixture for him too, essentially. So I don't think I'll be making any midfielder transfers, but let's go through each of them. So starting with Saka and Martinelli, I think Wolves away, you could look at this a couple of ways, right? Brighton scored a few goals against Wolves. I don't think Wolves are a tight ship like they used to be. I think they attack a little bit more, which leaves them a little bit vulnerable defensively. So I think this is a game that I could see Arsenal scoring goals. However, the narrative has been in recent weeks, and I do think that the eye test would support this, is that Arsenal look a little bit fatigued. They don't have the squad depth that other teams have that are at the top, or at least they don't seem to use the squad depth to the same extent. And I think the players are looking a little bit tired. And also, Arsenal aren't fantastic away from home. Again, data and eye test would support that. So I do think it's a decent fixture. If it was at home, I would be loving this fixture. I think there's a very good chance that both players haul. But I think away from home, with the lead up to the World Cup, obviously both Martinelli and Saka are going to the World Cup. I do think that there might be a little bit of fatigue. They might come off early just to rest them if Arsenal are 1 or 2 goals up. So I don't hate the fixture. For me, though, a few people have been asking, if I didn't own Saka and Martinelli, I think there are probably better midfield punts to take this week. I don't think it's a terrible fixture, like I said, and Arsenal are one of the best attacks in the league. I could see this being 1 or 2-0 to Arsenal if I had to predict. And again, if that's the case, I'm not backing there to be a lot of goals. I probably don't think they're the best options this week. That being said, I think there are other issues in my team that I would rather address, or other players I would rather sell. And I do like some of the striker options this week, maybe ahead of the midfield options. So for me at the moment, Saka and Martinelli stay, but I wouldn't necessarily advise buying them yourselves. I've got Rashford. I'm recording this directly after the Manchester United game in the EFL Cup. I've maybe got a slightly different opinion to other people. I've seen a few people say that they weren't impressed with Rashford. I thought Rashford was absolutely exceptional. He was lacking a bit of end product at points, but what I've noticed with Rashford, and again, I'm a Manchester United fan, I watch every single game. What I've noticed is he's looking a lot fitter. His stamina's great. He's shown those bursts of acceleration that we haven't seen over the last 18 months. He's looked a little bit sluggish. He just looks a little bit quicker over the last couple of weeks, and he just looks back to his usual self. He was obviously selected for the England squad. It's a little bit of narrative bias here, but I just fancy Rashford to do really well in game week 16. I think you can definitely get at the Fulham team. I know Man City struggled slightly, but I do think that was sort of a one-off game. They obviously had the early red card as well. So I fancy Man United to get a few goals here, and I think Rashford will be at the heart of that. He came off in the 81st minute, I believe, in the EFL Cup. So by all accounts, I'm expecting Rashford to do fairly well. In a similar way to Saka and Martinelli, I do think if Manchester United are 1 or 2 goals up and the game looks like it's secured, I do think Rashford will probably get an early substitution ahead of the World Cup. But hopefully by that time, if Manchester United are 2 or more up, then Rashford would have been heavily involved. So I do fancy Rashford to do quite well here. So moving on to the final player, which is Salah. Like I said, absolutely delighted that I kept Salah. I'm definitely not going to be selling Salah ahead of Southampton at home. The only discussion point to have around Salah is he the best captaincy option this week with all of the uncertainty around Erling Haaland? So I think my current plan is probably going to be not to captain Salah and to captain Haaland, but I'll discuss that in the next section. But just to say, if you want to captain Salah, I do not have an issue with that at all. I think regardless of whether he'd scored last week, like I said, the data's still relatively strong. Liverpool will still score goals, and this is a home fixture. Salah's not going to the World Cup, so we know he can play 90 minutes in this game absolutely fine. And I fancy him to do fairly well in the final game. So I think my midfield 4 is looking absolutely fine. I don't see any major changes that I need to make. I'll discuss it in the next section when we move on to my watch list, the midfielders that I'm potentially looking at if I do need to make a transfer. So if something crops up in the press conferences, or if we get early team news that one of my midfielders is out, I've got a few players that I'm looking at. But realistically, it's probably going to be a defender or a forward. So let's move on to the forwards, the bench, and discuss the team as an entirety. So finally, the 3 forwards. I'm not sure whether I really like my front 3 or really hate it as well. There's a few spicy picks in here, and I think this is something that I'm quite happy with. Is yes, my team's been fairly template this season, but I've also brought in a few spicy picks, and I think a lot of people maybe ranked in the top 1K wouldn't take some of the risks that I have. But I think Firmino was a slightly risky player to bring in. Alvarez was a very risky player, I think, to bring in and captain in 15. Even though we knew he started, it was still a slight risk. So I'm looking at the front 3, and outside of Haaland, of course, it is looking a little bit spicy, but also could have some issues. We'll start with Alvarez. My initial instinct is that no, Alvarez doesn't start, but I do think it massively depends on Haaland. So I think we've got 3 options. The first option is Haaland starts and Alvarez doesn't, and in that case, I would probably sell Alvarez. Whether we wait or not for early team news, I'll discuss that on the deadline. I'm still not sure. I might just confirm my transfers before in case the site crashes. But again, I'll discuss that on the deadline stream, which is back on Saturday morning. So that's the first option, is Haaland starts, Alvarez doesn't. The second option is Alvarez starts and Haaland doesn't. So Alvarez starts ahead of Haaland. Haaland stays on the bench again, just because they don't want to risk aggravating his injury, especially for what should be a fairly routine win for City ahead of the World Cup. Give Haaland the full World Cup to recover, because he's not going, obviously, can go through a full recovery process, maybe get a few friendlies in, and then be perfectly fine for sort of game week 17 onwards from Christmas. And then the third option we've got, which I've seen a few people discuss, is actually City play with 2 up top and Alvarez and Haaland play alongside each other. Pep has said on a few occasions that he likes playing Alvarez and Haaland against each other when teams are very defensive and play a fairly low block. I think Brentford are maybe in between. I don't think they're specifically a defence that play a very low block, and I don't think they're very defensive. But they're also not a team that tend to play on the front foot, again, especially against a team such as City. I think what Pep's talking about is I think they played him against, was it Forest and Copenhagen? They're the two games where Alvarez and Haaland have played together. Do correct me down below if I'm wrong, City fans. But I don't think the Brentford is the sort of game where he would want to play them alongside each other. I think Alvarez has also started like 5 games in a row for City now. So by all accounts, if you were to ask me now to predict, I think Haaland starts and I think Alvarez is benched. I think the least likely one is Alvarez and Haaland playing, obviously playing alongside each other. If Haaland is benched, then of course I wouldn't sell Alvarez if I had that information. So obviously a lot of permutations. I don't know exactly what's going to happen here. But like I said, my gut instinct is that Alvarez is benched for this one, comes off the bench. And if that is the case, I'll probably be looking at using my 1 free transfer to sell Alvarez. And the great thing is I do have 2.7 in the bank. The frustrating thing is that's not quite enough for me to get to Darwin, and I don't want to take it. If I had enough for Alvarez to Darwin, I probably wouldn't even wait for early team news. I'd just do Alvarez to Darwin because I do think Darwin is the best 1 week punt for this week. So that's the situation with Alvarez. I'm not entirely sure at the moment, but he is probably the most likely to be sold for me. And I'll discuss in the next section the players that I'm currently considering bringing in for Alvarez. Firmino's a tricky one because his data's still okay. Liverpool are still scoring goals and he's playing pretty much every minute available. He is coming off early in a couple of the games, but he's starting every game for Liverpool. I would expect him to start again because, again, he's not going to the World Cup. Depends which narrative you want to take. It could be that he tries to prove a point that he should have been taken. It could be that he's really down in the dumps because he wasn't taken. It depends how you want to frame it. I just think that it's a decent fixture. He's likely to start. I expect Liverpool to score goals, and I think I'm going to keep him for one final week. It is a little bit of sort of sunk cost fallacy. I feel like I've invested in Firmino. I feel like I've kept him for 4 or 5 weeks now. I might as well keep him for the final week too. The only thing that makes me slightly tempted to sell Firmino is, of course, I could, with my 1 free transfer, if Alvarez does start, do Firmino to Darwin. And whilst some people might see that as a slightly sideways move, Darwin's data is significantly better than Firmino, and I would expect Darwin to outscore him. So if Alvarez and Haaland do start up top and we get information and I decide to wait and I'm able to confirm that transfer, Firmino to Darwin does look like a really nice option. It just feels like the sort of thing that could happen, though, where I do that move, Darwin's either benched or doesn't play particularly well. Firmino finally gets some returns, and I would absolutely be kicking myself. So I think by all accounts, I'm probably likely to keep Firmino for 1 week, but I definitely won't be keeping him post-World Cup. And then Haaland is obviously the 11th player in the team. Like I said, at the moment, I'm currently planning on captaining Haaland. I think what is most likely for me to happen, let's see what happens in the press conference. I'm, of course, recording this on Thursday evening. We're going to get the presser on Friday from Pep. Not that he particularly gives us any information. I think what's most likely is that I will go into Game Week 16 with Haaland captain. If in the final 15 minutes before the deadline we get some early team news again and Haaland's not starting and I'm able to change it, great. But I think I would rather keep the armband on him and hope that he starts. And like I said, if I can make the change, then maybe I will. I don't think Salah's a bad captaincy option, but I just think that Haaland, unless Haaland's got a really tricky fixture, I think he's the best captain every single week. On the bench, like I said, the bench is actually looking really strong. I've got Gahey against Nottingham Forest, Doherty against Leeds, who I don't think will start. I think it'll be Emerson Royale, but if he does, it's obviously a great fixture and he's a great player. And I've got Andreas against Manchester United at home. So I wouldn't mind playing any of those 3, and it's one of the reasons that I don't think I'll take a hit, even if I find out like Alvarez and Haaland are both benched. I can just transfer Alvarez out, and then if I want to, I can start one of the other players ahead. So I don't think I'll be taking a hit because the bench covers me for this week. So that's the starting 11. I'm really happy with it. I don't think there are any massive issues. And one of the reasons that I am tempted to wait for early team news in the final 15 minutes before the deadline, even if I am locked out of the servers and I have to go into Game Week 16 with this team, I think it's fine. Yes, there's a chance Alvarez misses out, but I think the 7 attackers are really strong. I think the defence is fine, even though I've got 2 against Chelsea at home. And the bench will cover me if any of the players don't feature at all. So that's the way the team looks. 1 free transfer. Let's now move on to my watch list and discuss some of the players that I'm potentially looking at transferring in for the final week. So moving on to the watch list, and it's fairly straightforward this week because there are only so many players that I can take out and it's only for 1 week. I'm going to largely ignore the midfielders because I'm happy with my midfield 4 unless one of them picks up an injury or I see something in the pressers that makes me feel like I need to remove them. At the moment, the 3 players that I would consider are probably Kulusevski, Maddison and Zaha, but I don't need to because I'm pretty happy with my starting midfield. So I've pretty much got 2 options. I can either take out Alvarez if I see loads of predictions that he's not going to start, or if I wait for early team news and he's out. And I have up to 8.7 million if I want to take out Alvarez, which does rule out Darwin, which for me, if I look at all of the options available, leaves me with either Martial or Jesus. So those are the 2 options if I want to bring them in for Alvarez. And then if I think Alvarez is going to start, or again, if I wait for early team news and I know he's starting, I would probably take out Doherty and bring in one of Perisic or Trent. And at the moment, I'm leaning toward Trent. So I think those are probably the two likely things to happen. I would say in order, it's probably likely at the moment, I would say Alvarez to Martial, Alvarez to Jesus, and then the third most likely is Doherty to Trent, and then I would start Trent ahead of Castagna. The reason I'm currently leaning toward Martial maybe ahead of Jesus, and this is maybe a little bit, I don't maybe necessarily think this is the best way to think about this, but I've predicted that I don't think Arsenal will score a massive amount of goals against Wolves. I'm predicting, like I said, maybe 1 or 2-0. If I am predicting 1 or 2-0 to Arsenal, do I want to bring in a third Arsenal attacker? Now, I've said before, I don't necessarily think you should think of it as a triple up on the Arsenal attack. You should look at each player individually, and maybe that's the way I should be looking at this and thinking, Jesus puts up extremely good data. We're talking about probably the third best data in the league for expected goal involvement. So he's putting up really good data. I expect Arsenal to score at least 1 or 2 goals, and he's looking really good, and he's likely to play probably 80 or 90 minutes. So maybe I should look at it like that rather than thinking I don't want to add a third Arsenal attacker. But it is putting me off slightly. I obviously already own Rashford, so this would be a second Manchester United attacker. I don't know why. I just think there could be 2 or 3, maybe 4 goals for Manchester United. Fulham are slightly better defensively at home, so that is something to consider. But Martial has looked good. Now, Martial played, I think, like 61 minutes in the EFL Cup. Apparently, Ronaldo missed out through illness, so that does make me think, because Martial starting would have put me off slightly, because I don't think he's as likely to start 2 in a row, especially with his injury record and his fitness. However, if Ronaldo isn't fit for Game Week 16... I guess we could play Rashford up front and like Garnacho on the left, but I think it's more likely that Martial would get another 60 minutes. The only thing that puts me off Martial is, number one, I'm guessing there. I don't know for a fact it will start in 16. And the second thing is, like I said, I can't see him getting more than 60, 70 minutes. I just can't see him getting 90 minutes at the moment. And we probably don't need to with all of the other attacking options we've got. We've got Alanga coming off the bench. We've got Garnacho coming off the bench. Again, Martial can move centrally. So I think there are enough options. And I just think that we're probably likely to be quite careful with Martial. So whilst if I could confirm he starts, I still probably prefer Martial. The reduced minutes and the lack of certainty around his start would maybe make me lean towards Jesus. So at the moment, it's between Martial and Jesus. I'll say at the moment, I'm just leaning Martial, but I've got a feeling I'll bottle that just due to expected minutes and probably go for Jesus if I make the Alvarez move. I do really like the idea of Trent, though, and I think Trent's upside is just as high as the likes of Martial and Jesus. So it would be Doherty to Trent, and I would play Trent instead of Castagna, and that would mean that I would have to start Alvarez. So if we go back to my team here, it does cause issues if Alvarez is benched, but I guess he could do something off the bench, and if he doesn't feature at all, I've got Gahey coming off the bench. So I don't know. Let me know down below what you currently think I should be doing with my team. Probably leaning to one Alvarez to Martial/Jesus or Doherty to Trent and then bringing in Trent ahead of Castagna. Castagna would either go to first sub or maybe second. I'd probably put him first sub ahead of Gahey. So I think the team's looking strong regardless. Like I said, do let me know down below what you would do if you were in my position. I will be deciding on the deadline stream. The deadline stream is back. I apologise for missing it for Game Week 16, but I'm back for 15, I should say. I'm back for Game Week 16, 9 AM on Saturday, a full 2-hour live stream before the deadline, and I'll be going past the deadline too. So make sure to set your notifications, set your reminders, and I'll see you Saturday morning. Final thing before we end today's video, if I could just ask you to do one thing for me. We are carrying out research at the moment into the effect of fantasy football on our mental health. We've already run one study and published it. As you can see here, you can find this on Google if you want to read it. It's exploring the mental health of individuals who play fantasy football. This is an ongoing series of studies, and it's something that's very dear to my heart because I really do care about people's mental health and having a better understanding, and also putting things in place to hopefully improve the negative aspects of our mental health in association with fantasy football. So if you would like to support me and to help with the research that we're currently doing, this is our final week of data collection. I'll put a link in the top of the description. I'll try and remember to put it in a pinned comment as well. It's about a 20 to 30 minute questionnaire where you just fill out some stuff about you, about your experiences with fantasy football this season, and hopefully give us a bit of a better idea about the positive and negative experiences associated with fantasy football in an attempt, like I said, to find out more information and to hopefully put some stuff in place to improve the mental aspects of the game. So if you would like to support me, like I said, top link in the description, I'll leave that questionnaire. Please do fill it out. It would really help. And thank you very much. So guys, there you have it. That is my Game Week 16 team selection, the final one of the first half of the season before the World Cup. Lots of questions about World Cup fantasy content. There will indeed be fantasy football content for the World Cup on my channel from early next week. So if you would like to see some of that World Cup content, do make sure to subscribe. And like I said, I will be back for the deadline stream tomorrow, Saturday morning, 9 AM GMT. Tune in. I'm very excited to be back streaming, and hopefully we'll be getting that early team news around Haaland, Alvarez, and some of our other City options. Until next time, thank you very much for watching. Cheers. Bye-bye.